მადინას სახელი მეთქი ამ აუდიტორიაში ვიცი რომ ბევრს გაუგია მანამდეც და მის ტექსტებსაც ზოგიერთ თქვენგანი იცნობთ. მადინა არის ფემინისტი მწერალი და გენდერის პროფესორი ლინკოპინგის უნივერსიტეტში, შვედეთში. მისი კვლევებითი ინტერესები და მისი სახელი, აკადემიური სახელი დაკავშირებულია მის კვლევებთან დეკოლონიურ, ონტოეპისტემოლოგიურ გიებში და ხელოვნებაში. ასევე გლობალური სამხრეთის და სემიპერიფერიების ფემინიზმებს იკვლევს მადინა, კრიტიკული მომავლის კვლევებს და კრიტიკული ჩარევების კომპლექსურობას, კრიზისს და ცვლილებებს. მადინა არის არაერთი სტატიის და ბევრი წიგნის ავტორი. მისი ბოლოდროინდელ წიგნებს შორის არის დეკოლონიური ხელოვნება საბჭოთა იმპერიის ნანგრევებიდან, ახალი პოლიტიკური წარმოსახვა, პრობლემატიკა და ძიება. თან ავტორია ფრაი. ასევე ცოდნის რაობისა და გზნობის დეკოლონიურობა თანამედროვე ხელოვნების ცენტრში გამოიცა ეს ყაზახეთში. პოსტკოლონიური და პოსტსოციალისტური ფემინისტური თეორეტიზაციის და პრაქტიკის დიალოგების, გადაკვეთების, ბუნდოვანების და გამოწვევების შესახებ კრებული და კიდევ ერთი ახალი წიგნი არის ბოლოდროინდელი მადინას ექსპერიმენტული მონოგრაფია, ქართულად არ ვთარგმნეთ სათავე როგორც ჩანს, რადგან ძნელია, Narratives of Unsettlement, გადასახლების ნარატივები, ესეთი really difficult to translate into Georgian this title. დღევანდელ ლექციას მადინა წაიკითხავს ასეთი სათაურით საკუთარი ოთახის გარეშე, როგორია გენდერის კვლევების როლი აკადემიისა და ზოგადად საზოგადოებისთვის არეულობის გაურკვევლობის ხანაში. ჩვენ მადინას ლექციის შემდეგ გვექნება ისე პანელური დისკუსია გენდერის კვლევების თავგადასავლის შესახებ საქართველოში და ვფიქრობ, რომ მადინას ეს ლექცია, რომელიც უფრო გლობალურად მოგცემს კონტექსტს გენდერის კვლევების მდგომარეობაზე, რაციონალეზე, საჭიროებაზე თუ გამოწვევებზე, მე პირადად დიდი მოუთმენლობით მოველი ლექციის მოსმენას და იმედი მაქვს თქვენც მოусმენთ ყურადღებით. შემდეგ გვექნება, რა თქმა უნდა, შეკითხვის და პასუხის დროც.
Thank you very much, Tamar, for this generous introduction, and thank you everyone for coming to this lecture. I'm really happy and honored to be with you today. Tbilisi is one of my most favorite cities on earth, so I was really, really happy when I got this invitation and got another chance to come to the Caucasus. Originally, I'm also from the Caucasus, but I'm from North Caucasus, so we're neighbors in that sense, right? And this is probably for me the closest idea of getting to my imagined home at this point. But for the last 8 years, I've been living in Sweden and working in Linköping University as a gender studies professor. This was at first a very new experience to me because, as you know, in many countries there were no gender studies as established disciplines and still are not. And today I will probably stop on that at some point and dwell on that at some point. What is happening with gender studies? Do we have a room of our own? And that, of course, is a metaphor that most of you recognize. It's Virginia Woolf's metaphor, how important it is to have a room of your own in order to be a creative woman, in order to be an independent woman artist, but also not only artist, but thinker and activist. If we translate this metaphor into the area of gender studies, we can ask this question: what is happening with gender studies today as a discipline? Do we have a room of our own? And what is our role in academia and society at large in this age of unsettlement? Unsettlement is indeed very difficult to translate into many languages. It's a metaphor that we kind of played with Tony Fry in our book on a new political imagination. definition. And why I like the term unsettlement, because it has a literal meaning of being unsettled, of not having a place, of not having a citizenship, for instance, or being between countries, of being a refugee, right? So being unsettled in a very, very kind of material sense, but also in psychological sense. And all of us are unsettled at this point of time and of the condition that we are in, meaning that we don't know what is awaiting for us. We don't know what the future brings, and if there is a future actually or not. So in that sense, it's a very existential category, and not just a descriptive one talking about refugees or unsettled people. And also, I think what adds to this is the condition that not only gender studies, but many other radical critical disciplines are in today, that are accused of being too political and accused of being too activist. And it's not only in some countries that are associated with dictatorships, but it's also in quite many European countries today. For instance, in Sweden, that is considered to be so democratic, we also have this tendency when, for example, somebody defends a PhD dissertation on activist art or activist curatorship, they are accused of bringing politics into classroom, and that is considered not a good thing, while we, of course, collectively, people who practice this kind of suspicious disciplines, we protest and say that no, what about academic freedom, and what about our kind of goal and our actually need to question the society and constantly trouble the society and make sure that democracy is still being practiced. So this is the realm or the context, if you wish, from which I wanted to share some of my reflections with you today. And of course, I don't have definite answers for anything. Rather, I would like to listen to you. Maybe we can think together and produce some knowledge together, because that is the point of such gatherings, I think. And as an epigraph to this talk today, I want to show you a very short video clip by Regina Jose Galindo, who is a Guatemalan artist. And in 2019, right before the COVID and then later this geopolitical major crisis that we're inhabiting as a result of the full-scale Russian aggression in Ukraine, she made this work. So let's see. It's called El Gran Ritorno. So it's a march, but it's a march backwards, showing that all of these alt-right movements, anti-democratic movements, fundamentalist movements are getting over, actually. Okay, I hope that it shows. We used to have sound, but now we lost it. But anyway, so the sound here is the march. And people are marching backwards, as you can see. The orchestra is marching backwards. And she made it actually in Guatemala. It was her work of art that was shown several times, and at the same time, a very activist art, of course. But anyway, so we all are aware of the fact that there is a huge anti-gender backlash and various attacks on feminist and queer thought, art, activism. This often results in dismissing all gender-related agendas as being harmful or no longer relevant. And this is an interesting combination. Like harmful in certain countries, maybe, right? We see that in many countries, gender studies are cancelled, banned, they don't get prolonged as university programs, or no longer relevant. That you can hear in a lot of Western European countries. For example, when I teach some of my gender studies courses in Sweden, there is always one or two people who are anti-gender, and they come and they take the course, and then they write the course evaluation, and they say, in this society, we already reached long ago gender equality, so feminism is not needed anymore. So why do we spend the taxpayers' money on gender studies and on the courses? And this is a favorite argument of this post-feminist presumably post-feminist stage. But of course, it doesn't work that way, just as it doesn't work with democracy like that. You cannot say that democracy was reached and so we can forget about it. No, you have to work on it every day in order for it to happen. And the same, of course, with gender studies. And as you know, I'm sure many of you know, it leads to shrinking and closing of many gender programs, projects, NGOs, and that you can find again in many democratic regimes as well as authoritarian regimes. And right now, there are many examples that we can find in Europe. Since, as I said, I've been living in Europe for the last 8 years, I know more about that now. So I can tell you that there are attacks from the far-right movements and critique of gender studies and generally of broader, of all critical humanities, social sciences, post-colonial studies, gender studies, anti-racist studies, migration studies. They regularly get these attacks from the alt-right, nationalists, and other movements. And the very fresh example is, of course, the Central European University in Hungary that had to split in a sense, and so now part of it is in exile in Austria now, in Vienna, including the gender studies, because they didn't get prolonged. And in Poland as well, many gender studies programs are closed or they are renamed and made less dangerous, let's say, for the kind of political regime that is in power there. That leads to this reprofiling of gender studies programs into some kind of state-oriented, orthodox, for instance, family studies in Russia, or now I think in the higher school of economics they even called it men's studies and women's studies, thinking that it's less provocative than gender studies. And of course, all of this campaigns to criminalize feminism and feminists. In France, out of all places, we see these systematic attacks on Islamo-leftism, including at the very top levels, like the Minister of Higher Education and even the President. And again, this easily goes also in a direction of gender studies. And strangely enough, in France, which is one of the important places for feminism to actually be born, and emerge, currently there is very, very few gender studies programs, and they are all very limited and very instrumental in the way they are oriented, and not, for example, philosophical or epistemological at all. We also find it, as I said, in Sweden. We find it in the Nordic countries, not only Sweden, Denmark especially, our neighbors, this cancelling and the individual threats in relation to post-colonial, feminist, decolonial, anti-racist researchers. About 2 years ago, there was a case like that one in the parliament. The alt-right politician actually had a list of people with names, that he attacked, and among them were many of my colleagues and friends and co-authors, and they are actually afraid that they will be physically attacked. So nobody could imagine this, happening in Denmark, out of all places. And here I would like to quote maybe Andrea Pieto, who is one of the fighters in that sense. She's been working for many years, defending gender studies, trying to, as she said, repoliticize them, because she sees as one of the problems is that gender studies are not political enough in Europe. At some point they lost their political edge. And as a result of this, we're also having this, what is happening today. And Andrea Pieto, maybe many of you know, she is a professor of gender studies at the Central European University, and now has moved to Vienna. And she talks about gender research as a critical field that seeks change, and that is important to stress. stress, I think, and always reminds us that it came from the women's movement. It didn't come from some highbrow ideas. It came from the real fights of women, from social criticism, criticism of knowledge and production of knowledge. And this is crucial, and this is something that we have to keep if we want to have any feminist and any gender movement and knowledge production. Of course, she also comments on these illiberal forces that are removing accreditation for gender studies, such as it happened in Hungary, and talks about the dangers that it brings to actually any knowledge production. And she has a very, her own terminology for that. She calls it polypore, this kind of fungus that grows on trees, and then slowly the tree dies because it takes all its energy, all its life energy. So she uses this metaphor of polypore to describe the current state of Hungarian universities and higher education in general. This parasitic fungus that grows on trees, and the result of this liberal research policy is the growth, she says, of parallel institutions that appear to be scientific institutions, but in reality are not, because they lack freedom. The freedom of inquiry, the freedom of thought, the freedom of expression, the freedom from self-censorship. So this is, I think, important for countries like Hungary or Poland, and of course for openly authoritarian regimes like Russia, for instance, right? As the authentic study of gender studies is blocked by a specific kind of science policy of liberal states, the study of family policy as a specific scientific endeavor and a professional life belt was established or has been established, and many scholars have moved to these areas because they still want to do gender studies, but they are not allowed anymore. So they find different cracks in the system to continue doing this. And this, I think, refers to all of us, because many of us are in such situations, and gender studies programs are shrinking everywhere. And these global anti-gender campaigns are rising everywhere. And here I have a quotation of Judith Butler that many of you are familiar with. And today we already had Judith Butler's name mentioned in a very negative way, and I totally agree with you that Judith Butler is among those privileged intellectuals that sit in their ivory tower and is completely uninterested in what is happening in Ukraine or what is happening in Artsakh or in other places. So, but it doesn't mean that we have to cancel everything that she said or ever wrote, right? And so in this sense, I think she is right when she says that gender, unfortunately, is misunderstood, misinterpreted, and oversimplified, right? Is understood as a single ideology nowadays that refuses the reality of sexual difference and seeks to appropriate the divine power of creation for those who wish to create their own genders. Personal choice is understood to have taken the place of divine creativity. And this is a favorite argument of everybody who's kind of arguing against gender studies. This, I think, we need to take into account. The same Butler talks about these historical formulations of neoliberalism and financialization, and suggests that probably we shouldn't see them as the cause of the anti-gender ideology movement, but rather see a more complex and broader system in which they correlate to each other. Somehow they coexist with each other, right? So this heightened militarism allies with anti-gender ideology propaganda, but it's not that one is the cause of the other. They're actually kind of related in a more complex way. And here you see a lot of examples of recent anti-gender campaigns, many of them paradoxically led by women, right? So that is unfortunately a universal global phenomenon these days. And that, of course, still brings us back to the university. And I know that not all of you come from academia. Many of you come from the activist circles. So it's a different logic, of course. But since we are speaking about knowledge, I'm speaking about knowledge production, unfortunately, this is part of modernity, that knowledge is considered to be kind of centered in universities, because university is the main modern institution for knowledge production and distribution. And of course, we can question this and should question this, why it's a university and not other spaces and events and, like groups of people. It should be questioned. But at the same time, the university itself is also a problem, I think. And we need to kind of question it and dismantle it a little bit from within. Even if we are working still at the universities, we should work as tricksters from inside and kind of problematize a lot of things that are normative in universities. And here we have a quotation from Ryan Cornell's book, The Good University, where he says it's a university's job to serve its society, not to agree with it. Indeed. But unfortunately, the academic freedom and this freedom to question things, to kind of raise political questions is shrinking everywhere. It's shrinking not only in authoritarian societies, but as I was trying to say, also unfortunately in the so-called democratic ones. And all of these conservative forces, nationalist forces, they dismantle academic freedom and university as a bearer of oppositional ideas and an obstacle for privilege, as Cornell says, under the guise of defending academic freedom. And this is really an interesting paradox, how logic is being misused here, because recently I remember that there was an alt-right investigation in Sweden that was related to art sphere and to curating, and as a result of this investigation or report, it was decided that actually it's very bad for the sphere of art when critical humanities come in and ask their critical questions, because then they are denying the freedom of art, and it's also including its freedom from politics. So it's a very, very problematic and conflicting, contesting ground. Like, to what extent you want to go there, right? In order to question things and cancel things and put tags on everybody. And at the same time, do we want to have art that is completely detached from society and its problems? And that is unfortunately what happens a lot. I see this a lot, especially in Swedish society, which pretends that it's like the best and that doesn't have any problems. And that's why even the important things, like the ones that were touched in the previous panel related to environmental problems, for instance, right? Or the Anthropocene, they are completely depoliticized. And a lot of feminist issues are completely depoliticized. And they are detached and divorced from political and social reality, which then results in this very problematic kind of research that can be easily presented as not needed anymore, or something that we shouldn't waste our money on. And this is unfortunately what happens. And of course, that we can summarize as the canceling tendency and also decolonial educational initiatives that can be very radical, but can be also very cosmetic. When I say cosmetic, I'm sure you understand what I mean. It happens a lot today when people have all these campaigns. Let's decolonize sociology, let's decolonize philosophy, let's decolonize this and that. But most of the cases, it's just a slogan. It doesn't really bring anything, or it's a very mechanical thing, like let's include some new names. Yeah, that's fine. It's really important, of course, to include non-European names, for instance, right? And we all try to do that whenever it's possible. But it doesn't really change much, because this doesn't change the whole structure according to which university functions. It doesn't change the fact that universities today is a neoliberal business venture. It doesn't change how money is distributed and who decides that. In some cases, it reminds me what happened, for example, in the US in the 1960s during the big movements for human rights, anti-racist campaigns, when for the first time in history on American TV you could see, for example, black faces or Asian faces. But did it change anything? Not really, because it was a theatrical kind of multiculturalism, because people were just reading news, but they were not really responsible for any decision making. And that, of course, is much more difficult than to just proclaim that we're decolonizing the curriculum. Yeah, so it's not enough, I think, if we are serious about it. Yeah, and then, of course, it comes to a question, what are the possible subversive steps? If we are still there in the belly of the beast, how can we question things if we are still working at the university, or it's not possible? Because some people who are radical, they would say, yes, yeah, if you work at the university, then you are a traitor to feminist cause, so you cannot do much. I think we still can do things, and we've been doing it for many decades. Yeah, even if you are teaching some very conventional discipline, like I remember I was teaching all my, during my career in one of the Moscow universities, like 15, 20 years ago, I was teaching a course which is called History of Philosophy. And I even managed to decolonize that course at that point, because it depends on what kind of texts you read and what kind of comments you have with students, what kind of things you discuss with them. So you can do it with very patiently with every course, with every author you are reading. It doesn't have to be like, okay, let's forget about the university. Although at the same time, I do agree that the university is a deeply colonial institution, and it's not possible to completely decolonize it. It's possible to build something alternative instead of the university or along with it. But while we are at it, while it's a lot of work to do that, right? We can still and should still do things from inside the belly of the beast. And among these things, well, what the university authorities prefer is mainstreaming, of course. They all talk about mainstreaming of gender studies, and I hear that a lot from my dean, for instance, or whatever. I mean, the deans, of course, are elected in Sweden, so every several years we have a new dean, and each of the deans says, like, oh, do you really need that many programs in gender studies? Maybe you can just include a gender element in whatever you're teaching, right? So at first it was a gender element. Now it's a new fashion. It's not a gender anymore, it's environmental element, right? So sustainability element that we have to all include. Yeah, I mean, we can laugh at mainstreaming because it's very limited, of course, right? It's just adding this cherry on top of everything. But it's very mechanical, and it's very much a ticking of the boxes exercise. But even that is important. Even that should at least be present in all the courses. And then, of course, we should be reinstating ourselves as yet another discipline while constantly rethinking its content and its onto-epistemic frames. And when I say this, I mean that, yeah, I am very critical of any disciplines. I am an anti-disciplinarian person because I'm a decolonial thinker. But at the same time, again, if we are working in the system and we're criticizing the system, maybe at some point it's better to have it as a discipline and to have it as gender studies, separate studies, because that allows you to argue for some rights within the university and within the academia. And this is what has happened, for example, in my current department. They didn't have gender studies as a discipline with the programs for students, you know, but then Nina Luke came, a famous Danish feminist, and she founded actually this program, and she took it to a different level. And she's herself, now she's retired, but she was herself and is herself now very critical of gender studies in a disciplinarian sense, in the sense that you were talking previously in the previous panel about this kind of disciplinary nationalism and all that. But at the same time, it's a pragmatic thing. In order to be considered seriously in a university and to be seen as a knowledge producer, we need to have a discipline, at least for a while. Even if the university is not in ruins but in ashes and soon is probably going to collapse everywhere. And this is my favorite topic, so I won't go too much into that because then I can concentrate more on criticizing the university as a kind of institution that lost its contract with the society, I think. What I mean is that previously, the university at least guaranteed you a job. So you would be interested in having a degree in order to find a job later, but now it doesn't work that way anymore. Even if you have 2 PhDs, it doesn't guarantee you anything. So that previous contract is not there, and that's why I think we are in the midst of changes, and the university will lose its prestige is already losing, and so alternative spaces and kind of, environments for knowledge production will come forward inevitably. And that's what I mean by more radical steps to the link from academic limits, building alternatives at the borders, at the edges, between academia and the society, and creating these learning platforms. But of course, it's easier said than done, right? Because if we are doing it with people who are still working at universities, or they have their precarious positions as PhD students or young researchers, they don't have time for that. They need to survive in this world. They need to make money somehow to have their families fed, And that's why it's very taxing for them to be working basically for free in order to create some of these spaces and some of these initiatives. We tried several times with several groups of people to do it, but it's very hard. And it's always a question of financing. It's always a question of finding time and all this. At the same time, what I found more attractive maybe in the last 10 years is finding these alternatives in the art world. I work a lot with different artists, art activists, and curators, museums, on very different levels in different countries. And I don't know, maybe it's my impression from a little bit from the outside. It has still more fluidity. It has more possibilities to create this alternative knowledge production spaces. Sometimes not spaces, but events maybe, because they're not permanent. They just happen, and then it's not. They don't become institutions, which is good, I think. So that I think is important. And for me, in the last maybe decade, that was a more productive space of knowledge production, let's say, to repeat productive twice. Yeah, so it was more creative, it was more fruitful, and also freer from these university academic constraints that are imposed on all of us. The question is then how to legitimate these steps at the moment with the major university crisis, because I think that the university crisis actually works in a very strange way. Like, the less money universities have, the more control they impose on us, on people working there, so that soon the university would turn as an institution into some auditing space, because basically we have to write all sorts of reports all the time, and we are always checked by the authorities, but people forget that the point of having a university is actually knowledge production. It's actually thinking together. It's actually having a discussion, a dialogue in a classroom, and not just, mechanically learning something from some kind of facts or textbooks or whatever. And that, unfortunately, works on every level, not on a bachelor's level only, but also at the level of PhD, where also knowledge becomes extremely instrumentalized. It only answers the question how, and very seldom asks the questions what or why we are doing something, and what is the point of knowledge production. Yeah, and also all of this also exists not in a vacuum, but exists in a very toxic geopolitical environment, as we know, right? And I think that the full-scale Russian aggression in Ukraine has actually intensified all of these tendencies and has triggered a very acute conflict that was already this or that way mentioned in your discussions this morning. In these conditions of neo-imperial violence, feminist and queer knowledge, I think, is very important and can play a role in transcending this binarity of thinking that, of course, is inevitable whenever a war of that gigantic scale comes into question. And also in trying to imagine some other alternative or ways of worlding, of kind of imagining the world, making it possible, and also surviving in this world. And also of thinking about the future and making this future possible again. That's what we call the refuturing with Tony Fry in our book. And in this sense, I'm thinking that the two current big narratives that are kind of in the center of attention, they are political narratives, but they are also onto epistemic narratives to some extent. The two narratives that don't intersect at all and refuse to hear each other, I call them provisionally the anti-colonial narrative and the anti-Soviet narrative. And I will try to explain why. The anti-colonial is clear, right? It comes from the anti-colonial tradition, and it has long roots, and then I mean, theoretically you can find it in post-colonial studies, in post-colonial theory, and in a more radical way in decolonial option as well. And this is a tradition which also comes very close to the global left, let's say, right? So it's very critical of capitalism, of course. It's very critical of neo-imperial tendencies and all that. And it sees colonialism, global colonialism, and its aftermath as the main event that defines modernity, which I completely agree with, and this is what I've been working on for 20-something years myself. But at the same time, the specificity of our situation, of many people who sit here also, is that we also had this socialist experience. It's a state socialist experience. Today, nobody wants to be called post-socialist for a good reason, right? But it's still this specific form of coloniality that was marked by state socialism, this ideological form of coloniality also, is important. And it's very confusing for the global left, both in the global north and in the global south, because they cannot agree with criticizing socialism. They cannot agree with criticizing the left ideas, Marxist ideas, post-Marxist or what have you. And also, I mean, this is like the lighter side of this misunderstanding and hesitance. Even before the Russian aggression, full-scale aggression started, they were very hesitant in criticizing socialist forms of coloniality, let's say. And when I was interviewing, for example, for our collection with Reddy Kubak and Suruchita Parbjorken, I was interviewing several people from the Global South. They were very, very hesitant in looking into these colonial darker sides of socialist modernity. But after the war erupted, it became really a catastrophe, because at first, as you know, there was no reaction, and there was still people are very hesitant from the global left, and including the post-colonial and decolonial thinkers, to comment in a critical way about the behavior of this Russian neo-imperial rogue state. The darker side of this, that unfortunately also needs to be taken into account, is what I call victimhood rivalry. Why? Because in modernity, one of the main principles is agonistics. It's like, fighting for your importance and representation and, material things also. So it's important to prove that you are the main victim. And in that sense, these two narratives clash, because one of them says that the main victim is, of course, the colonial other. And the other says, no, the main victim is those countries that were, which Soviet Union took under its influence, and the West never did anything and never helped them to become independent, right? And so this is the anti-Soviet narrative that we find in the majority of Eastern European countries, and they were also the ones who clearly and from the start showed their alliance with Ukraine and their sympathy for Ukrainian causes for a good reason, because they knew what they're dealing with, right? And the same, I think, happened in Georgia, and the same happened in several other countries. This is very interesting, because these are two different narratives and two ideas of victims and two kind of struggles, to define what is the main narrative of modernity, the main narrative of the 20th century and 21st century now. If we go deeper into that and we analyze the situation, we see that actually we're talking about the same modernity/coloniality, but it just manifests itself differently in colonial side of modernity and in the so-called Europe, including the peripheral Europe and semi-peripheral Europe. But there is no MSSR today who would be be able to say that, okay, you are kind of shocked with fascism or with Nazism, but actually Nazism is doing the same that you were doing to us since the 16th century in the colonies. So this is what needed, somebody who, or a group of researchers who would be easy to overcome this, you know, and maybe instead of just concentrating on your own victimhood narrative, try to hear the other, be genuinely interested in the other, and develop love as a political category, love for this other that is so far from you. And it's interesting that more and more of this I can see in discussions of the former Soviet colonies. For example, recently I was at a conference in Södertörn University, which is a university in Sweden. It was organized by colleagues from the history department. And there were many people who came from different Central Asian countries. And there were also several really strong and powerful Ukrainian activists and curators. And at first, the dialogue was it was not happening because each of them were discussing their positionality. And especially, of course, the tension was visible when the question of European identity came up, right? Because, of course, the Central Asian people cannot claim a European identity, and they're constantly, considered as Asiatic, and that is seen as something negative. And so what they lacked first in a very strong Ukrainian critique was like, what about Europe? Like, why are you looking at Europe uncritically? So shouldn't we practice a double critique? And this, I think, is a very important thing. Like, how do we practice double critique, not on paper, but in actual knowledge production? And this is something that I want to bring up in a book, a new book that I'm writing now. Because many years ago, I think in 2005 or something like that, we did a special issue of South Atlantic Quarterly with Walter Mignolo, and at that point, it was just the beginning of the colonial option. Nobody knew about it, and so we wanted to invite people from these colonies of the Soviet Empire and see what they think about it. And the idea was to critique both global neoliberal capitalism and kind of the global side of this coloniality, but also the local neo-imperial tendencies, especially when we talk about such an empire as Russia, which is a second-rate empire, which is constantly trying to catch up with the West, to become like the West, is never allowed into the league, And so that was the idea of this really, really complex double critique that in the colonial option comes from Abdelkabir Katibi, who first wrote about it in relation to Arab sociology, I think. But then I think gradually many of my decolonial colleagues and co-authors, they lost that doubleness of their critique. They lost, it became very simplified, and now a lot of them only see capitalism and mainly the kind of collective West or the United States as the main enemy, but they fail to see that the critique should be on both levels, that you cannot forget about Russia and just, prefer not to even discuss that, because if we lose the doubleness of critique, then we are risking actually to accept dictators like Putin or like several others that are in the making or already we see that what is happening today, right? So that I think is very important, and that's what I want to criticize them for in this new text, because I don't want to be associated with what many of my decolonial colleagues right now, both in Europe and in Latin America, unfortunately. That's what I found really interesting in the discussions we had in this Södertörn conference, because I think that several of Ukrainian thinkers and activists, they came up with this and they said, yeah, we are very different, but at the same time we share certain things, and so we have to find what we share, and without losing our difference and our different trajectories of colonialism, we still have things in common, and we have interests in our histories, mutual histories that of course we didn't know much much about, because this is how coloniality works. It doesn't want you to know anything about the neighbor. It wants you to constantly fight for your own cramps, from the masters. And that I found much more rewarding and fruitful potentially, than any of these theorists sitting in Ivy League universities and writing something like Judith Butler or some of my decolonial colleagues for that matter. So that I think is important. And again, I wanted to give you maybe an example from art, and I know that some of you will critique me for that and say that contemporary art is very elitist. Yeah, I mean, sometimes it is, a lot of it is. But I will give you an example that I find really refreshing because it doesn't come from elite people. It comes from really young, unknown Central Asian artists that were gathered together by Saudat Ismailova, who is an Uzbek film director. And now she's famous, but at the point when she was doing it, she was still emerging, I would say. And so she found this about 20 people from different countries, and they did a very interesting ongoing project that started as a part of Documenta 15, and Documenta is a very elitist kind of Western, it's not biennale, but it happens every 5 years, I think, and it's very important for contemporary art. And most of the time it was very Eurocentric. It was never interested in the margins of Europe, of course, and to say nothing of Central Asia. But what they did is that they used this opportunity and this money that they were given, and they created a project in which the idea was not to manufacture art objects and put it on the walls of the White Cube in the museum, but the idea was to, again, create knowledge together, to have conversations, to have discussions, to have these immaterial things that they produce as a result of this project. It's called Davra, and if you translate it, it's like a circle. It's a circle of thinkers. It's a circle of people who sit together and tell stories about their ancestors or about, I don't know, their grandmothers. They share some affects. They share some memories together. They have some things that they're not the same because they come from different countries, but at the same time, there are certain things that they share. And yes, it is an example of grassroots democracy and collective governance and sharing of knowledges, of artistic ideas, of tools, of approaches, of resources. And I was really fascinated with that. I went there and we did several of their collective rituals together. In that sense, it was a true decolonization for this space of Documenta, which was always before a very Eurocentric, elitist exhibition. And what is good is that it didn't stop with that, because even today, almost 2 years after that, they still continue working together. They still create things together. And I think that what I found most interesting was that there were a lot of people coming just to this pavilion where we were, and they didn't know anything about it, but they all stayed and they listened to our stories, to our constant exchange of knowledges, exchange of images, of ideas, They were just interested, and that was the point. Like, how do you create this relational aesthetics? Not on paper, not as a theoretical concept of Nicolas Bourdieu, let's say, but as an actual thing of how it can work. Unfortunately, we don't have sound, but I don't know if there's a technician here. It was before, I'm sorry, but for some reason it's no longer. Oh, okay, good.
Says you have steppes and deserts and mountains, but we don't have sea. We're landlocked. And this piece of land, I think, remains as a blank space for imagination of a lot of people internationally, especially in the art world, in cinema. So I thought that it would be fantastic to bring together artists from Central Asian countries, which are ex-Soviet Central Asian countries. So my space is about the Chiltan, which are 40 entities or 40 spirits, mostly female. In the case of my version or what I have been working on, with a focus on female spirits, because they can also be non-gender, they can be shapeshifters. And they come to protect the world when there is a crisis and when the rational cannot help anymore. So for me, I thought that it's kind of comes together. Who are the Chiltans of today? For me are the living entities, female artists, young female artists from Central Asia, but not only young ones, because we have showing films of established filmmakers and artists, so really like having this presence, direct or indirect presence of female creative energy here in Kassel. So I think that is that story.
Okay, this is just to give you a taste of what it was like. Maybe to just finish, because we don't have much time left, I wanted to come back to the idea of having a room of one's own and how important it is and what to do if we don't have a room and there is no hope of having it in the future, if we're a discipline without a room. And it looks like the university is not developing, unfortunately, in the direction of having more rooms for more critical disciplines like gender studies. And again, artists and activists, they are faster maybe than academics to react to that, right? They are more sensitive to these issues, these changes in politics, Like several years ago, one of my very good friends, Estonian artist Lee Nasib, who's very political in most of her projects, she started doing a project which is still ongoing. I think it's a photo project, and you have to know how it came up. Like this is from one of the essays written about this project. It's called "A Woman Takes Little Space." Very telling, right? So the author, Agne, here says about this project, it all started with a discussion in the Estonian media where it was revealed that the country had the greatest gender pay gap in Europe, out of all places, Estonia. The phrase that struck the artist Lee Nasib was that women actually needed less money and less space than men did. It was one of the people in the parliament who said that, and therefore they should be paid less. She was very ironic about this and made a whole project in which she was taking pictures of women in different circumstances, in different professions, who are all taking as little space as possible, including herself in her studio, where she also has very little space. And again, it's happening in Estonia, which is actually one of the exemplary countries of this kind of post-Soviet or trans-peripheral, as now it's preferably called, right? In this kind of euphemistic way, countries that is actually quite successful in many cases, but still used to have one of the largest gender gap. So these are some of the examples of women that take little space. And their rooms of their own are very small. And as you can see, most of the professions, most of the things they do in life is also very telling, like what are you allowed to do as a woman? What is the limitations that are imposed on you? As I said, she's herself included there as an artist, because a woman artist, or woman academic for that matter, is also still in a vulnerable condition. Okay, so I don't want to give you any kind of conclusions. I hate that, because I don't really have definite answers for anything. I just wanted to share with you some of these concerns maybe and reflections, and I'm really interested in hear what you have to say and your comments. Thank you very much.
Can I?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much for the presentation. I guess my question lies on understanding the integration of queer and feminist activism within the academic institutions, because as you've established already, the biggest gap lies into the reasons for which people go into academy, first and foremost, and when it comes to gender studies, women's studies, queer studies, these reasons and these underlying causes for what you need the education and degree for are qualitatively different. And when you learn so much theory and so much historical context of where it began, how activism started, and how it affected the trajectory of the entire situation nowadays, you kind of develop all these empathetic and theoretical frameworks that are useless and outdated, although you need to know, but you do not know how to be this playful within the system player so that you do kind of yield some results at the end of the day. And there is no sort of guidance whether or not which destination, which discipline, which institutions are even looking for people that are skilled and interested and, I don't know, ride or die on the field for them to kind of translate their academic performance and understanding of the situation. So my question would be, how do you think institutions, although historically not necessarily inclusive of the disciplines that we're talking about, can promote such integration so that activism becomes argumented as well as realistic and how to say this? Relevant. I guess you understand my question, and sorry about the emotions. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if this topic will be raised in throughout these days, but I want to ask about actually artificial intelligence and cyberscape as like as part of like knowledge production and distribution, including academia. And I was curious, like what are the tendencies in academic spaces around it? Is it seen as a tool, or is it seen as a threat, or people just don't understand it? Like how is it, like, because it is a game changer now, like in many different fields, but I don't know like how it is in gender studies specifically, and in social sciences in general. So I was wondering about that.
I would like to applaud organizers for bringing this subject, because it's something that I myself also see. My capacity was built through participating in Karat Coalition activities, Invite activities, Women in Development Europe. And what I see last years, it's something that brings me that we need to think more, to analyze more. And my question is also, whether you have analyzed how murder of Anna Lindh was, brought, how it happened. Because if we will see, it happened in the democratic European Union. Murder of Olof Palme. All these events, how it's happened, deep-rooted, what is going on?
I teach queer theory and feminist theory in Kiev and in Ukraine, and the metaphor, I mean, I'm not a fan of Virginia Woolf's book, but the metaphor of the room I think is really interesting, and in my experience it's less by gender, but more by your precarious status as a young researcher or someone who is a refugee or someone who is not having a tenured positions, and now both in Ukraine and in Germany, this is the majority of people. So usually we don't have a room of our own, we have like a cramped space that is just really difficult to work, and even the rooms that we are given as people who teach seminars are usually also quite problematic. But my questions are a bit in a different venue. I want to ask you, when you are talking about Ukrainian critiques and feminists and queers, or queer activists and researchers and artists from Ukraine, whom exactly are you talking about? Like, what are the names or the groups? Who are your collaborators that you're working with or you're referring to? And another question also, as a refugee myself, I want to ask, when you are writing on unsettlement, what is your relationship to the literal unsettlement, and how does this a fact what you're writing? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. All questions are wonderful, very, very different. So I will just go one by one, I guess, because you cannot combine them in any way. Integration of queer and trans thinking and knowledge production in academia is a very good question, and I don't think that academia is going to do anything to integrate this kind of knowledge. It's not interested, unfortunately, in that. And that's why maybe it's more interested in some mainstream, predictable kind of gender studies that then people can find jobs in some NGOs, maybe in some sort of predictable, again, state-sponsored organizations. Like in Sweden, I see that a lot. Many people who graduated from our programs, for instance, they then go and work for, even sometimes migration board and, some kind of state organizations like that, which is not bad, but at the same time, it's a very specific kind of gender knowledge and, the specific, very selective sort of knowledge production that is promoted there, while the more critical edge that you mentioned is not so easy maybe to support. But I think that the university, at least in my experience, is not really interested in that. So maybe it's again a question of doing it in alternative ways, not waiting for the university to do it. Because we tried several times to raise this question, how do we work with people who graduated? Do we even have a network of those? And we tried to do it, but in a very unofficial way. Because I think that one of the problems of this current neoliberal university that is developing in different parts of the world with different speeds, of course, but still it's a general global tendency, is that it's not interested actually in maintaining these sort of connections, in intergenerational links that the university used to be built on before, yeah? Like before we always thought in a slow old university, like, okay, we have younger colleagues, we need to promote them, we need to find them some kind of jobs so that they can learn from the older generation, and then there will be some kind of, connection, and the knowledge will be slowly produced. But now it's completely lost. Because in the majority of European universities, as you might know, we only have full professors and PhDs that have some rights, while everybody who's in between have short-term contracts, and they don't know what's going to happen with them in 1 year or two, or if the kind of grant expires, And this is not a sustainable way of knowledge production, I would say. And people just, they come and they go. They come and go. They are used and abused by the system, and then they disappear. And that's why I say that the university is not possible to actually decolonize, because it's so deeply problematic as an institution. So unfortunately, I don't have a positive answer for that. I think that we'll have to create these kind of things ourselves somehow and find other resources for this. Artificial intelligence, it's interesting that you ask me about that, because I'm the person who constantly avoids talking about that. Maybe because it's my negative reaction to what's happening in Sweden today, because Sweden is one of the places that is very interested in this, investigations of artificial intelligence and robots and all that. And this is basically the only sphere for which you can get a grant. They will not give you any money for any philosophical investigations or humanities-oriented, even for women's rights. No, not any longer, but only this. But unfortunately, it's very one-sided. It's very biased, because if I look at what kind of applications are, because they're all public, you can read them, they are actually marked by this romanticizing of artificial intelligence. They don't see it as a threat. They don't go deep enough to see that it is actually very problematic, and it triggers what can be called maybe a technological coloniality, technological forms of coloniality in the future. And this needs a lot of investigations, but instead of that, I see only positive results. And I'm not criticizing, they are needed too. For instance, my colleagues have a huge grant at the Gender Studies Department on robots, which allowed to hire 2 or 3 new PhD students, which is wonderful and positive. But when I look at what they do, it's like, for instance, they they talk about robots that will be used in care practices and nursing homes. And so they discuss how to program these robots that will be so nice for the people who, elderly people there. So it's a feminist ethics of care that is used on robots. But I find it very one-sided, because it kind of excludes so many people who don't even have access to this kind of stuff, right? And so with people dying at wars right now, right, with people not having anything to eat, like we just heard in the morning, during these blockades and all that, why should we discuss, robots used in care system? So I do think that you're right. It's a major problem that needs to be addressed in all its aspects, both negative and positive. And the only thing I see now that at my university, for instance, we were asked to add all our course descriptions the fact that if students are using artificial intelligence to compose their papers, which should be forbidden, and there should be ways of checking this. But again, it's very instrumental, right? So it discusses, how to make sure that they are not using the robot to write an essay or examination, but they don't go deeper into that, into these questions of what it entails for our human intelligence, for instance. So I don't know. It's really an open issue, and I think that, as usual, we come up as a species, humanity comes up with a lot of more technological gadgets, but we are much slower in the way we perceive them and we reflect in an ethical way about them. So it's a huge problem, totally. The murder Anna Lind and other, not only that, because there were several events in the recent years, right? It's so scary. And right now, actually, when I was leaving to go here, there was another case when there was a course on gender studies, on migration, on racism that was taught in one of the Swedish universities. And both the professor and the students who took the course, the PhD students, they were attacked. And they got personal attacks that if you continue doing this, we will find you and kill you. And it was so bad that, bad also in the way the university failed to react to this and failed to support these people, and to actually try to provide some security for them. Because, in Sweden, everything is transparent because they assume that, why should we hide anything? So even your address is public. So anybody can very easily find where you live. And so many people suffer from that, and there are several political murders recently in connection to that. And when we had our last, not the last, but the one before that, conference, like National Gender Studies Conference, there were threats that there will be bombs, and so it's really there. I mean, it's a democratic country, but you have this, and you see how vulnerable we are, and how all of these institutions actually don't have any mechanisms to support or to make sure that nothing of this kind happens. So in that sense, we never feel safe. At least I don't feel safe there in that respect. And I see that many of my colleagues are targeted, and we are criticized constantly, and there is no way the institutions will defend us. So what can happen? I mean, it can be really worse. I think it's going to be worse, especially that now in most of these, for instance, Scandinavian countries, in many cases we see the alt-right parties that are coming to power, and everything is changing just in front of our eyes. Like yesterday it was a different country, and today you cannot recognize it. For instance, one of the new proposals that is offered by Sweden Democrats, and this is one of the ultra-right parties in Sweden that is now in the parliament, they say that let's make everybody who sees a suspicious-looking immigrant or migrant report them. So they want to make it a requirement, including the universities and the dentists or the libraries or anybody who's connected with the state, to be reporting. And if you don't report and somebody sees that you're not reporting, then you will be both reported. So I mean, imagine this kind of atmosphere of everybody totally depending on this reporting. We try to do something. There are many organizations who are protesting, but I don't think that it's going to change anything. And that is a very, very scary thing. Like even in the working democracy, it can happen. Yeah, and special thanks for the last question. I mean, I have different connections with different Ukrainian colleagues. For example, a year ago, I was invited to Venice to give a kind of a lecture on decolonizing art in Venice Biennale, and I was invited by the Ukrainian Institute, and I met there with several really interesting people, including Katerina Botanova, who was also at this conference that I mentioned, and she's really, really interesting as an art critic, as an activist. And then there was another conference that I organized myself, and we had there Oksana. Now I forgot her last name, but it will come back to me, and I will tell you. So she's also a queer activist and a PhD student right now, I think. And her contribution was amazing in our workshop on unsettlement, and I think it was very good that we had her. And also I'm right now working with another art critic and curator who is connected with Ukraine, Svetlana Bidarieva, who lives in Latin America, I think, but now we're writing I'm taking part in one of her applications. So I mean, there are different connections like that, and of course I have a lot of connections with Ukrainian researchers in Sweden because we have several in Södertörn University, like Yulia Yurchuk, who organized this conference, historical conference, and also several others. And I would like to have more, but I mean, because I come, as I mentioned, I come from Northern Caucasus and Central Asia. I worked all my life more on those regions and on those kinds of coloniality. And I'm now learning and discovering a lot and reading a lot of texts about Ukrainian art and Ukrainian decolonial movement. Yeah, and I forgot also there was a very interesting group of authors who wrote a very good article for our collection on post-colonials and post-socialist feminisms. Olga Plachotnik and Maria... Yes, that's right, yes, yeah. So that was really, really also an important encounter, and I think they came a couple of times to Linköping and gave really interesting talks. So I mean, I have, but I am now developing more these connections with Ukrainian thinkers, and I'm learning a lot, and I hope that it will be more of that in the future, because I completely I'm disillusioned with many of my decolonial colleagues from the global south, because I think that they were blind and insensitive to what is happening. And I would rather think that if some changes happen, they would have to happen on this bottom level, as you were saying, like it has to be grassroots, bottom-up activism and thinking together, rather than some big theory that is we are trying to apply to anything. And as for my own unsettlement, I mean, I have been all my life an unsettled person. Of course, luckily, I was not a refugee. I mean, I didn't have to go through that. But when I was living in Russia, I was unsettled because I never belonged. I was always seen as a racialized person there because I'm not Russian. I have no Russian blood. And living in Moscow, for instance, I was always put in my place and told, like, you're a black, you can't be a professor, you should kind of, keep your own business, and you shouldn't be even allowed to work at the university. Because the toxic nature of Russian racism is well known. but seldom was discussed then. And in that sense, I would say I was unsettled, and I was in this internal kind of immigration all my life, all the years that I had to spend there. In that sense, I don't even feel that much this unsettlement in Sweden, because now I'm unsettled for a reason. You know, like in Russia, I was a citizen, but I was still seen as a second-class person or third-class person. While in Sweden, it's okay, I'm racialized, I'm put in my place, but I am a foreigner, so it's fine, right? And also the problem is that I don't want to be assimilated. I don't want to be an exemplary minority. I like to not belong in some sense, and I think it's normal for a feminist and also for a person who is kind of critically minded. In that sense, I'm unsettled, and also because as all of us, I mean, it's not a unique thing for me, we don't have a future. We are unsettled because the world doesn't have a future. We don't know what is going to happen as a result of the climate change, as a result of this geopolitical toxicity that we are all kind of living through now. Also because I come partly from Circassians. My father was Circassian, and Circassian genocide and what happened afterwards, and the exile to Turkey, and the fact that now 4.5 or 5 million Circassians live around the world, live in Syria, in Jordan, in Turkey, in other countries, and only a fraction of them still live in the Northern Caucasus, and our territories are taken by other people, right? So that is also important because we are one of the stateless nations. And so in that sense, if I think of my Circassian side of my identity, I am unsettled because whatever we had, our history, our traditions, our language, all of that is lost to Russian colonization, and what is happening today only continues the same tendencies because our language is dying, and only maybe in the next generation there will be no people speaking it. So that is an unsettlement kind of background that is always there. And of course also as a feminist thinker, as I said, I am unsettled, and I should be, because I think it's a healthy condition of being critical to everything, and first of all to myself. And I think it's important to keep it that way. Thank you.